The first tool we're going to use is called a concrete placer, and this is going to be used to get the concrete into place before we start using the screeder. One thing to note too is that once the drum has stopped spinning up to the slump of 5, which is what we're going to use, you don't want to be adding any more water to it, because the more water you add to this concrete, the less strength it'll have by the time it's finished. Another thing to note too is make sure you guys wear PVC boots, because if you're walking around inside this stuff using just tennis shoes, then you're going to run the risk of getting burned pretty bad, as this stuff is pretty caustic. Since we are about halfway finished placing, we can now begin screeding. Screeding will strike off the surface and get it as level as possible. We will want to do this entire area at least twice. There are different types of screeds to use, but we are going to use a 2x4. If you use this as your screed, then make sure it is not warped, because that will leave voids as you go over the top. There are also a couple different ways to screed. First is to use the seesaw method, but as you can see here, our 2x4 is a little bit shorter than it should be. The other way is just to drag the board over the top. We also have to make sure that as we are screeding that the concrete is placed just ahead of the board to fill any voids that are there. Holding the board at an angle also provides a better edge and grip. lightly pass over the screeded area with a float called a Darby, which will level some ridges and fill the smaller voids in and around the perimeter left by screeding. We will also take out any extra concrete that may not have been done so by the screeding process. A Darby has a longer reach, but it may not reach out far enough, so you may also want to use a bull float. When using this tool, keep the float as level as possible, don't go too fast, and float using semicircular patterns. Raising the edge too high at first can seal the surface and trap the rising water. Once we have filled the small gaps along the edges, we need to begin our first pass of the bowl floating process. Now what a bowl float does is it will consolidate the aggregates, levels the high and low spots, as well as bring some more of the cement paste to the surface for further finishing. A bowl float will also aid in keeping the surface torn open to permit the escape of bleed water. So as the concrete settles, water from the mixture begins making its way to the surface, which is why it's called bleed water. We will want to make our first pass with the bowl float and edging tools before the presence of this bleed water. Sealing and trapping water under the surface using these tools will lead to delaminations. And since our slab has air entrainment, which also makes it kind of sticky, we will want to be using a magnesium bowl float, which won't pull or drag the surface like a wooden bowl float will. If your slab does not have air entrainment or a low slump, then you will probably want to use a wooden one. Concrete is porous, so air entrainment is used for freeze-thaw environments by adding an agent to create many small and microscopic air bubbles. When a freeze-thaw happens, the water in these small areas have a place to expand and contract, so it won't lead to scaling. Also, if you use a trowel, such as a Fresno, then it will seal and densify the surface, as well as work some of the air out, leading to those surface deteriorations. So it's not recommended to hard trowel an air-entrained mixture. When using the bowl float, you don't need to go very fast or push very hard. Remember the word float. Just gently glide it out and back in with the edge just slightly raised above the surface of the concrete. If the edge is raised really high, then you will end up plowing and sealing the surface of the concrete. As you bowl float, begin bowl floating perpendicular to the direction that you screeded, and when bringing it back, float it past the edge of the concrete closest to you. Also, we don't want to overwork the surface either, which will bring too many fines upwards and cause crazing. Now, I initially planned to be doing this finishing process alone, so I ordered an initial set retarder, which would give me about an hour extra to complete this process. The drawback to a set retarder is that once the time is up, the concrete can undergo a rapid setting process, which would make it difficult to finish. Where I now have help, and this will be faster, we will have to wait longer for the bleed water to undergo its process of showing up on the surface and being absorbed back in, as well as through evaporation. Having air entrainment and fly ash will also reduce the time it takes for bleed water to show up on the surface. Now, normally in colder weather, you would not want a set retarding admixture with a crew because of having to wait longer to finish. This additive is associated with hotter weather or longer travel times for the truck. begin our first pass of the edging process. If bleed water has shown up after bowl floating, we would want to stop all work on the slab and wait for the bleed water to dissipate. Bleed water can take up to 2 hours to resolve, but since our bleed water has not shown up yet due to the admixtures and cooler temperature, we should be alright. Edging will give the concrete a finished appearance, as well as create a curve that will resist chipping on the perimeter. When starting, we must be sure to keep all the forms and the edge free of debris. We also want to make sure that we do not start rounding the edge at the corner of the slab, but begin about 6 inches away and work back into the corner to help avoid depressing the corner edges down too far. There should only be a slight trailing mark on the outside edge of the tool on the concrete, and as before, low speed, very light pressure, and a slightly raised edge. After edging and grooving, you can hand float out the lines left by the other tools, and if you have help, someone can flow them out right after you complete your edging step. When using a magnesium hand float to get the lines out, keep the tool as flat as possible, use very light pressure, low speed, and float in semicircular patterns. We want to keep the pores open on the concrete at first, and then as the concrete stiffens, we can slightly raise the edge a little higher during later finishing passes. After edging, our next step is to use a snap line in our concrete, which we did not film, to mark a line for our groover to follow, and we will use a straight edge to guide it along. The reason a groover is used is to create a contraction joint, so that when the concrete shrinks, it will crack along that path instead of at random. A groove should at least be 1/4 the depth of the slab and every 10 feet, if 5 inches thick. We will want to groove at least twice, the second time once the concrete stiffens a bit more to avoid what is called groove bonding. You can also saw cut your expansion joint, just be sure not to wait longer than 24 hours, and do so after 4 to 6 hours, given that the concrete will resist raveling from the saw. Time and temperature are all influencing factors with saw cutting. After making the first pass with the groover, our bleed water has begun to show up. We must wait for the surface water to dissipate before any further work proceeds. Bleed water has a wet look, a noticeable sheen to it, which can be a little bit difficult to capture on camera. Here you can see the reflection of the blue recycling cans on the surface moisture. While waiting for the bleed water process, we can clean off our tools that we no longer need and clean the ones that we will use again. This will prevent the concrete from hardening on them and making lines in the finishing process. You will also want to make sure that you do this on the rental tools before bringing them back to avoid being charged a fee. Now that more of a dull surface begins to show, signaling to us that the bleed water is nearing an end, we will use a second pass of the edger. Then during the finishing process, we will float the lines and imperfections out. Now that the edging lines are worked out, notice the middle area here that is left to work on. As you can see, there are still slight imperfections left to remove. You can remove these with your trowel or float by leaning out into the middle using your other tool to lean on. You can tell when it's safe to finish and use your weight to lean on it by firmly pressing on the surface of the concrete with your thumb. If the imprint is no deeper than 1/8 of an inch, then it is generally safe to proceed. It is said that hard troweling or even troweling is not generally recommended on exterior air-entrained slabs, for the reason that you will work the air out of the surface. So you can achieve finishing operations just using a magnesium hand float, though with enough experience, finishers have troweled exterior air-entrained mixtures with an artful and successfully timed eye. You can use the steel trowel to remove slight imperfections. However, if you raise the edge too high with the trowel, you seal and densify the surface, as shown here in this one sweep example. Notice how shiny the surface gets when the edge is raised too high. So the steel trowel will be used very flat, with no pressure to keep the surface open without sealing it. last tool is the use of a concrete broom. Use this tool to go perpendicular to the direction of travel for a slip-resistant option. As you go along, make sure that you brush off the concrete built up on the bristles before each pass. There are also brooms made specifically for doing this. You should only need to broom the entire area once, and if it begins to pick up too much concrete as you push it out, then you will need to wait until the concrete hardens a bit more. Concrete should ideally be placed between 50 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and adequate temperatures must be maintained during the curing process. Concrete generates its own heat, called the heat of hydration, and during cooler temperatures this benefits the curing process. The greatest of this heat is generated during a 3-day time period. The curing process is pretty vital, and our final step must involve the proper curing. There are different methods such as water curing, plastic sheeting, or membrane forming compounds. I'm going to use an acrylic membrane cure and seal, which when applied will aid in preventing excessive moisture loss, which will lead to lower strength. You can do this as soon as finishing operations are complete. My sprayer got clogged with something, and as you can see I'm having a little trouble getting an even fan of spray here. Though later on I was able to get another tip, so on the left side the cure and seal is a bit thicker than normal. ACI 306 says the definition of cold weather concreting is, quote, when the air temperature has fallen to or expected to fall below 40 degrees Fahrenheit during the protection period, then use cold weather concrete practices, end quote. Curing this late into October can potentially freeze overnight, so using this membrane forming compound along with using curing blankets later on will help keep my slab strength continuing through the initial critical 7-day compressive strength time period. I want to make sure that my concrete is protected from freezing, so using curing blankets with an adequate R value is especially important during the first 24 hours so that it can reach a minimum of 500 psi. After reaching 500 psi, then the slab should at least resist 1 or 2 freezes. Now there's a lot that goes into determining the strength of concrete. So here's a chart called a maturity method, which is an example chart that can be used to determine strength based on time and temperature. However, this chart is not conclusive for all mixed designs. To be extra safe, I'm going to recommend foot traffic stay off for at least 3 days and vehicles off for 7. It takes around 28 days for concrete to reach its optimum compressive strength in the right temperatures. Alright everyone, that concludes the do-it-yourself concrete project. Thank you so much for all your support on the forums. Thank you so much everyone that came out to help me today. I will see you guys on the roof. My roof has a leak, and so the next plan is to rip this roof off and get a metal roof. That's the plan at least. I don't know if I'm going to be doing much of the installing the metal roof myself, but I am going to tear it off. However, as far as the concrete goes, I hope it lasts at least a year. I will give you guys an update in a year and see how it looks, see if there's any cracks or anything. Unfortunately, the problem is still down there, but I had to get it fixed. Didn't know what else to do, but thanks again guys, and thank you everyone for all your support.